All right, 5:30. We're going to call this work session to order. It's like we're just missing Supervisor Shirley for now. Do you know if did you hear anything from him? No.
I haven't heard. No.
Okay. Well, we'll see. Nope.
Okay. He's done.
No excuse. I'm kidding. All right. Where was I?
Call to order.
Yep, we're calling it to order. Let's do roll call. Sure. Well.
We're just roll a couple more times to be here.
We can start on this end and then.
Yeah, you can just. Who you represent?
Oh, Jerry Van Zomer, District 18.
Do we need to use our microphones?
Ryan Shirley, District 13.
Scott Counter, District 11.
John Anderson, District 2.
Carrie Rice, District 5.
All right, business item number 1, training regarding conditional use permits.
Good evening, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is set up. Apologize for the delay. I'll just pull up the agenda packet. I apologize to Supervisor Counter because I think he asked for this training on CUP permits about 6 months ago, and we just haven't had time on our agenda or everybody available for this training. And so I didn't put anything together individually myself, just to remain neutral on this topic. And so we reached out to Lynn Markham and Becky Roberts from the Center of Land Use and Education, or what they call CLU, and they provided some slides for us that are actually back to around 2020 time period, but a lot of this is still very current and is newest and latest and greatest in CUPs. So I'm going to skip that first slide because it's got some old dates. So as some of us know, and that there is 2 parts in any zoning ordinance, the zoning map and the zoning text. Both of them can be amended, of course, throughout the process. And what this is relevant is because in every zoning district, we have permitted uses, which are allowed by being zoned that way. We've got conditional uses, or CUPs. We've also got prohibited uses. And so those are generally the 3 types of uses that we have in each zoning district. Then when we talk about the different types of legislative levels, we have what the CDC does here, which is the ordinance development, the amendments to the ordinance. That would be the legislative side. The variance, conditional use, and plat reviews is a quasi-judicial side. So that is still where there's a public hearing, there's a little bit more due process to it. And then the one over on the right here, which is just an administrative, that's where our staff are. These are the permitted uses that are allowed within that zoning category that basically if we go through and if they meet the performance standards or requirements in the ordinance, we can just issue the permit and be done with it. There's no public hearing. So zoning goes all the way back to 1920s, and in the 1960s is when CUPs became widely adopted as a way to take and handle zoning. The old way in that they used to do it is they actually called them a special exception. not a CUP. And so those terms are completely changeable, and that the courts have decided that several different times. There was a big change in 2017 because CUPs, and that went from being more up in the air before that to you could actually deny a CUP. 2017 Act 67 says that if you got an ordinance and it allows for a use as a CUP in that zoning category, that at that point, you have to grant that CUP, and that as long as the applicant is willing to agree to the criteria or conditions that the board might assign to that CUP. So that's kind of where we're at today. And so that's where it's important when we're amending an ordinance to make sure that we don't put conditional uses in a zoning district that are not appropriate to be within that district. So I've kind of went through the permitted, conditional, and prohibited uses here already. Now, one thing to point out is that a variance cannot be obtained for a prohibited use. So if I'm zoned residential and I want to have a car detail shop or a car shop there, you know, that's not a permitted or a conditional use, and that I can't apply for a variance to that. That would be a use variance, and the Board of Adjustment doesn't have the authority to grant that variance because it goes back to the Community Development Committee is the one that's creating the ordinance underneath that legislative function, and the BOA cannot go above that function. So what governmental unit has the authority to approve CUPs? And the answer is it varies across the state. Some counties still have their BOAs doing it. Some counties have their planning or zoning agency doing it, and that's how we are here. So, but they definitely do not go to the full county board. So, conditions, of course, are able to be assigned, and that for any CUP. Conditional use standards. So this is one here. So there's a recent court case in 2017, All Energy versus Trumbull County. The county identified 37 conditions for a new silica sand mine, but then they still voted to deny the permit based on public health, safety, and aesthetic concerns. The Wisconsin Supreme Court supported their action, and then they took and argued it for more local government control. So in that case, and that the CUP must be granted except in extreme circumstances. So when we go back to the purpose and intent of the ordinance, again, they denied because of the health, safety, and welfare, and that is a big concern, and that for any CUP. So if you're gonna deny a CUP, you're gonna wanna tie it back to that purpose and intent, which is generally that public health and safety. Please jump in if you got any questions as I'm kind of going through this. I already went through 2017, Act 67. So more specifically, what Act 67 says is that it defines a conditional use means a use allowed under a conditional use permit, special exception, or other special zoning permission, but does not include a variance. So again, we're talking a use, we're not talking an exemption to a setback or even a height. As with any of our CUPs, we take and we have a class 2 hearing notice, and then it is decided here. And if it was to be appealed here, it would actually go to the Board of Adjustment. And then from the Board of Adjustment, and that they could file a writ of certiorari, which would take it to the courts level. So there's really a 2-step appeal process here. Now, a lot of times, and that if they take and appeal it directly from here to the courts, and that we would say, hey, they didn't follow the due process, and that to go to the Board of Adjustment first. So when you're thinking as the policymakers and you're considering any request, any of the requirements or conditions on the application must be reasonable. And of course, staff, we always like it if they're going to be measurable. And so, because if we can't measure it, it's pretty hard to take and make sure that they're in compliance with that criteria on the permit. So, and what Act 67 did say is that you must use substantial evidence to determine what conditions are reasonable. So you can see reasonable is kind of a big gray area. Substantial evidence is a big gray area. But again, going back that the conditions must relate to the ordinance purpose. So that's where that's kind of tying in. That's still your grounds for any kind of conditions or denial for that matter. One of the things that before Act 67 is that you couldn't really limit the duration of a CUP and that it was good forever. And so some counties have chose to put a term on the CUP permit. For example, St. Croix County, we've got a 5-year duration on our non-metallic mines. And so you could also do that on any use. So maybe we have a sawmill permit, you could put a duration on it of 5 years if you wanted. Generally speaking though, the idea behind a variance conditional use permit is that if the owner follows the criteria on their permit to be able to operate, that those conditions or criteria are offsetting the negative impacts of that use to the adjoining property owners. And so the use should really be able to continue in the foreseeable future because we should be mitigating all of that other stuff. And so in a lot of cases, it doesn't necessarily make sense to have a duration on it. But there is some that at times where it might be nice. Same thing with a variance, it makes sense to have a variance to build a shed, 2 feet closer to the property line than what is normally allowed, and then say it's only good for 5 years, and that because the shed's gonna be there for probably more than 5 years. Yeah.
So, if let's say the distillery that we permitted last week. So, in a case like that, would it be good to put a term on that so that they couldn't sell that to somebody who could turn it into something that he doesn't understand when as far as a conditional use permit. And going along with that, does that mean they would have to, after, let's say, a 5-year term, they could re-up that they could apply it once again?
Correct. So they would be able to apply again. So I guess, in my opinion, I'm not a big fan of putting a duration on any kind of CUP because CUP is very specific. And so if I come in for a brewery, distillery, whatever, and that's all I'm going to do, and that's all I can do on site. But now let's say all of a sudden I want to take and I want to serve some meals, that would technically take them coming back in, reapplying for another CUP in order to do that. Now, maybe the CUP is just for this building, but now they are adding on a dance hall to that building. Well, now that use is changing again. Now they got to come back in for another CUP. And so when we advise applicants as staff, we try to take and say, hey, what do you want to do on the property? Even looking, 10 years down the road, and that to put that on this application now, because otherwise they will get caught in that double application process, and that because they're going to be expanding the use beyond their current approval of that permit.
Let me give a different example. Let's say it's an adult bookstore. Give them a 5-year term, or do you let that open-ended so the next person can buy that property and continue on, maybe make it something more so than just a bookstore, maybe a video store besides that, or, so wouldn't that term be good to put on that, so that it's only for that one person, or can you put the term for the person who owns it, so if another person purchases it, he has to come and get his own conditional use permit?
The answer is yes to both. So you can put a duration on it, or you could take and put that it's only good for the current owner, and upon ownership transfer, they have to renew their CUP permit. It's up to the committee at that level. Again, and that generally, whether, you know, I or Sam down the road or Joe own that property, and that we're still tied to the permit that was issued to the property and the conditions that are with that. So no matter who's got the management or the money behind it, it really shouldn't matter as long as they're still following those conditions. But any kind of expansion of that use now, and that where they're having the bookstore and now maybe they have a dance club there, you know, that would be an expansion of use, and that would make them reapply.
Yeah, that was my point, so would it be better in that case to give them a term, and then the next person who would buy that would have to do his own term, or the term for the person rather than for the bookstore?
Yep. Yeah, you can. A lot of business developers and that might not like that as much, just because they're investing in the infrastructure and that for the building, and they maybe got commercial plans, and so there's always that unknown. And that's one of the things, just in general, banks and financing, they don't like CUPs as much as they like a zoning change, because a CUP is, again, specific for that bookstore or specific to that brewery, and that when they change the zoning on a property, now I can put a bank in there, I could put a car dealership in there, so the property's got much more value because it's got much more uses possible to it. However, and I've always said I've been a big fan of CUPs because it allows you to look at every single property individually and to try to work with that property owner or whoever wants to do that kind of use on that property to mitigate the impacts to the surrounding neighbors and property owners. And so you get more property rights in that, if you will, not to get on that kick, but also in that you don't have so much spot zoning in the country. So in that you would not have so many little blips of commercial or industrial throughout the rural areas of the county.
I guess I have a problem giving an open-ended conditional use permit. I just think that's pretty dangerous, because you don't know what tomorrow's gonna hold. And I think it would look bad to a CDC for just giving that open.
Yep. Well,
My
if you want to put terms on it, we can even make sure that we have it as a standard. I mean, if you want it every 5 years, whatever that might be. And that I haven't seen conditional uses become an issue just in my career, because again, they're specific in nature. However, I did see commercial zonings along the lakes of Polk County, and that were an old restaurant or something like that shut down years ago. Most of them were actually bait shops, you know, and now people were acquiring the property because it was a commercial property, and they were trying to do marinas, and they were trying to do restaurants and stuff. So, and everybody's like, well, where did that come from? Well, it was rezoned 40 years ago, you know, and so we don't do too many comprehensive amendments to our zoning ordinance where we change the whole zoning map of the county, you know, so stuff can sit out there and it can just linger for many years. So that's the risk in that with changing zonings.
And just to add on to that a little bit, to your question, it might be more efficient to limit the transferability, or that if the property is transferred to a new person, they need to come back in and, you know, renew the conditions instead of having a duration on it. Just because you don't want the people to have to come back every 5 years to renew, but if it switches to a new owner, you could put a condition on there that when it's transferred, when the property's transferred to a new owner, then they have to come back before the Community Development Committee to renew the conditions or to review the conditions. And that might address your issue, Supervisor.
So this slide here kind of explains substantial evidence a little bit more. So the best we can do to define what that means is that it's facts and information. It's directly pertaining to the requirements of the conditions that would be applied. So a lot of times, if they're coming in and applying for a conditional use, you know, in the front side of the property, and let's say that they've got some junk way on the back side of the property, that wouldn't be a reasonable condition to take and make them clean up all that junk back there, and that in order to have their CUP permit. If they're in violation on the junk, that should be handled by our staff automatically. It's not something that you'd want to tie to this permit application, for example. And that reasonable persons would accept in support of the conclusion. So I'm glad that we got all you on the CDC, because I think you're all reasonable persons. So we're gonna only have good conditions and based on substantial evidence. So yeah, that was supposed to be a moment of humor. Yeah. So
For now, we're all reasonable.
yeah. I'm not as funny as Ken, so anyway. So in the ordinance, we've got specific criteria for any conditional use permit application. You see these in our staff reports at every meeting. And so it is the applicant's responsibility to make sure that they address each one of those. And we're fortunate, a lot of our staff here are helping the applicants and that try to address each one of those criteria. But that really helps the committee create a good record and a solid ground if we are ever to be challenged or if we are ever to be appealed. And that because we're addressing each one of those criteria in the ordinance in order to grant the CUP. So, and then the statute is very clear. If the applicant and that for the CUP meets or agrees to meet all the requirements, conditions, criteria for that permit, that the local governmental unit, as in the county, and that shall grant the conditional use permit. That's not a may, that's not a, hopefully, and that it's a shall. So that's where we had a conditional use permit here a couple months ago, and we had some opposition from the town about building code side of it. Now, that's where our staff still suggested approval to the committee, but we had a condition in there that would definitely meet the substantial evidence side of it that said that they must comply with all local, state, federal permits needed for their use. So we still addressed the town's concerns, however, we stayed in compliance with statute and that way. So that's why we suggested what we did. Okay, so here's just another court case, 2019, Echo Site versus the town of Cedarburg. Again, and that the town board denied the CUP for the failure to meet the three standards: welfare, compatibility, the impeding of surrounding development and improvements. So these were the standards that they had in their ordinance, similar to the ones that you see us within our conclusions of law all the time. And so they found that they didn't meet three of those standards, and so that was how they denied. So they talked a little bit about loss of value. I'm not going to go through each one of these because there's quite a few of them. But again, tying it back to the purpose, health, safety, and welfare. And basically the substantial evidence here. So the Court of Appeals found that the testimony at the hearing supported the town's conclusion the tower would be incompatible with the adjacent land and that they would suffer substantial diminishment of property value and adjacent properties. And so the town's CUP denial was upheld. So that's kind of similar to like rezoning, and that we're always considering the adjacent properties and what they're being used for. So that's always something that you can fall back on. So we've already kind of talked about this. So of course, here would be the CDC or the committee, and go to the Board of Adjustment, which is our appeals board, and then it would go to the court, and then appeals court and Supreme Court. So again, if they jump ahead, and that's usually a good thing that we can fight. So they need to follow this process. So Highland Sportsman Club, City of Delafield, they did a shooting range and they denied it, and that because of the safety concerns located between commercial and housing development to the south. And that was, and that overturned, and that because the Court of Appeals found that the city's denial was arbitrary and capricious, and thus being invalid, and because they didn't make any findings. And so when we do that findings of fact, conclusions of law document at the end of the hearing, that is something that they didn't have. And so that is really our tool. And I know it seems like it's duplicating our staff report and stuff all the time, but that is the legal grounds on that we have for the application. Okay. And then, so sometimes, let's say that you did make a choice on an application to deny, and it went to the courts. The court could also say, well, maybe that there was a flaw in your process, and that they want to take and do a de novo hearing. So they could take and remand it back to the committee to take and rehear it, reconsider it, and go forward. But they definitely don't have to do that, and so that's not what happened here. So they only got one chance to put their best evidence forward for that application. And that's really the part here that's on conditional uses. There's some other good stuff. Like I said, I left these slides in there because it talks about it, but now it'll go into talking about what do you do if you are wanting to change the ordinance. Again, the biggest thing is to review the purpose and intent of any ordinance, and that to make sure that they're accurately reflecting the goals and objectives of those ordinance provisions. Also, reviewing the land use classifications here. So this is kind of an example of our use table under 15.285. So the Cs in that are identifying it as a CUP, just making sure that those uses are in the correct zoning district or classification. And then we've got a pretty good process here, but we can also go through process changes. The standards, we did amend those, and that when we amended chapter 15 back in March. So I think those are pretty well updated for the 2017 Act 67 standards. So is there any other questions? As far as any prohibited uses like this, and that we've got a general phrase that says any use not listed in the use table is prohibited. So that's where, but then at the same time, we've got conditional uses not listed. So that's like, we've had a couple of those that were kind of in the middle of major home occupation and contractor storage yard, so it still gives the committee then the discretion to decide if that's a reasonable use on that piece of property. And so, but in short, and that the big thing with any conditional use permit is you can, like I said, evaluate the merits of the application and the proposed use on that property. For example, if you were to take and have a shooting range on, 2,000 acres and it was in the middle of it, it might not have any safety concerns. Maybe it's got a really nice backstop. It might not have a lot of noise concerns, but that same use or impact on a 2-acre parcel surrounded by a whole bunch of houses, it's totally different, so. And the zoning district doesn't necessarily take that into consideration because that same shooting range may fall underneath commercial use and that for like a commercial gun store, but yet it's still only 2 acres and it's right next to the houses. If that makes sense. So changing the zoning is much more riskier than granting of a CUP. Yeah, Supervisor Van Summers.
Just a point of clarification, because we're going to be talking next about the solar thing. So the Xcel Energy does not get a conditional use permit for that, do they? They do
No.
not need it because Wisconsin says you don't.
Correct. Yep. But the way our current ordinance is right now, any renewable energy project 100 megawatts and smaller is a conditional use permit. And we have seen a couple of them for like St. Croix Electric on a much smaller scale, so.
Yeah, so just because that's one question that I've received, and I was quite sure it was correct on that, so.
No.
That's given the green light no matter what happens.
Correct. And the last thing I'd just like to take and say about conditional use permits is the bad thing about them is that they don't necessarily have the same level of town control as rezoning does. So rezoning, the towns have ultimate control, I'll say, because the statutes allow them the opportunity to object to any ordinance text amendment or any ordinance map amendment. And so that's when we amended our comprehensive plan here as a county last year. We made sure that our comp plan aligned as much with the towns as we could so that we wouldn't have areas in that where we didn't agree on. But right now, if you want to take and change the zoning of your property and you go to the town and they deny it, we don't even allow them to apply to the county. And that because we could go through the whole process, the town could object and tie it all up anyway. And that a CUP and that the town is only advisory on that because they don't have that same level of objection authority. However, that's where you as the members of the committee, can take and get town feedback. The town can still definitely provide feedback, and they have been on these. And you can look at it and say, well, I think the town is reasonable on that condition. I think we should assign that to this application, or I don't really see how the town is using substantial evidence to justify that condition, and so then you're not going to apply it. So you don't have to apply everything, but that is probably one downfall if there is any downfalls to the conditional use.
Can a town ask for a review of a CUP that's already outstanding? Say, for instance, our example was a shooting range in the middle of the countryside. Say the town wants to approve a major subdivision, can they ask for that CUP to be relooked at with the housing subdivision to one side of the property line?
No. And once it's granted, it's kind of like an existing use, it's already there. Unless you have that renewal that comes in, so like our non-metallic mines, for example, if you had an existing mine and it comes up and there's a new housing development that gets built throughout this first 5-year period of time, when they come in and reapply 5 years later, maybe then we could assign some extra buffer or some extra trees along that boundary line to buffer those new homes because there's a change in the adjoining property.
The towns could bring it to community development's attention if someone's violating the conditions, though. So if there's a violation of the conditions, obviously the department will need to know because then they can seek revocation of that permit if someone is not following the conditions.
Yeah, and so if they violate the conditions of their permit, and that technically the way the ordinance and that reads right now is that it's automatically deemed revoked. And that now, if it's on purpose and that, our office would probably administer it that way. If it's just something in that, maybe that we got a new owner in there and they didn't realize something, we still work with them on it. But yeah, technically right now, it's done if they violate. There's a lot more enforcement though, and that can happen. And that instead of, let's say that we've got a use that's just a permitted use, and if they violate, Then we have to go through the citation process and the court process trying to shut them down. There's not as many good avenues in that, whereas if we have a conditional use, we can pull that permit, and then we already know that they're illegal, and now it's a lot better standing in that with the court. We got a lot more to stand on and that to support ourselves in that litigation to seek an injunction if that's what we decide to do. Any questions? Okay. We,
Jason,
and
sorry.
Supervisor Counter, yeah.
In a case where you have a long-standing conditional use that's been there for a long time, somebody's using a property a certain way, and then it, over time, we'll say a lapsing of 30 years go by, and it's under new ownership, and the new owners don't really review the conditional use permit that came with it, with the property when they purchased it, and they do things that are in violation of the original agreement. I guess two questions on that. If the agreement was done and minutes were taken as to the conditions, which it was not as fortunate a way as having it physically in writing, but can those conditions still be enforced?
Yep. As long as we have the minutes from that meeting and what those conditions were. Yep. As long as we
Okay.
have something to prove it.
And I think, Jason, what you said is you would try to work with the property owner first, bring it to their attention. Hey, these are all the conditions. You're violating this, this, and this, and this. We'll give you 30 days to comply. But if you don't, then we'll seek revocation. It then gives them a chance to, fix what they've done wrong. But if they don't comply, then at least there is an avenue to revoke quickly.
Yep. And back to the town comments, that we're not trying to not have the towns involved. Every conditional use permit application that comes through our office, and that we send it immediately within a day or two, and that out to the towns so that they can provide feedback. It's just not like they've got the ultimate say, at the town level. That's all. So.
Well, the reason I ask on that is something like, for instance, a condition where you have a specific buffer, a tree buffer that was established, and the tree buffer is a noise buffer for major event things that are going on. And now they decide, well, we're gonna cut that buffer down. We don't see that as to our advantage anymore because we have other uses for the property. And so now that's gone. What could we do about that as far as enforcement opportunities, or how would we handle something like that because of what the detriment is without the buffer being there now?
And it was a county action in that did it? I mean, because
Originally, it was a CUP agreement, but it was done during a formal meeting versus having something done. It would be on minutes, but it isn't an agreement that was signed.
okay. It sounds like it'd be an enforcement action and that we would want to follow up on. I mean, if there was a way that we could get the similar impact or similar mitigation for that impact, and that maybe noise, and that we could work with the property owner on that. If they can't come to being able to mitigate that, then they could end up reapplying and that come back through, and maybe they do something else so to mitigate the noise.
One for you. One more
So-
for you.
Yeah.
So an existing CUP is say 20, 30 years old. If somebody were to purchase that property and they were to think that some of the conditions were too harsh or whatever, can they ask for to renegotiate the CUP?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. they would reapply for that use as long as it was still listed in our ordinance as a potential conditional use. They could take and apply and try to reduce it. And that could be, 3 years, 2 years, that down the road, hey, look I've been, operating 2 years now. I've got good behavior. I need this to be removed, so, yep. Okay. Maybe it's, satellite toilets and we say, yeah, you gotta have 20 satellite toilets there. And now they're like, hey, we're just not getting as many people to come anymore. And can we drop that down to a more reasonable number for our current attendance? Be totally possible. So we did hold a training with Becky and Lynn Markham and Heather and that last year over at Baldwin Ag Center. And we invited all the local municipalities and stuff in. We actually had it 2 different fold. We really had Board of Adjustment and then we had Planning Commission or Town Board. And so Becky and Lynn are very busy people in that, but hopefully, in another year, like every other year, I usually try to get it so that if we got new members coming in because of the election or whatever, that we kind of hit during their term. So we'll probably try to set something up like that again in the future, about a year from now. So, okay. All right, are we good on CUPs?
You got another question? Yeah, go ahead.
Supervisor Rice.
Well, for one, I really want to thank you for putting this together. This does at least help so we kind of understand some of the background and the steps that are into it. And want to commend you. You did a great job on trying to set some of this straight. So thank you.
I didn't put it together. That was all clue. So anyway, but they are the experts on it. Yeah, Supervisor Rice.
Well, 2 things. One, going back to kind of the time limitation one, which has me thinking, from a practical standpoint, let's say there's a CUP with a time duration. At that use the 5-year point. At the 5-year point, who initiates the outreach to say it's time to renew? Is that something we own?
Usually it's the applicants. So
they have to remember.
and that correct, or we catch it and that afterwards, and that. So yep.
Okay.
We don't have a real good tool right now, and that would notify us. Well, I should say that we've got the tool, but in the past we haven't been using it. So but like new ones going forward, we would have the ability to track that and actually run a report to notify those. So,
Okay.
but that hasn't been the past practice of our office.
Okay. My follow-up question is, everyone here takes our jobs very seriously. I had lunch with Buck Malik, who runs our Board of Adjustment, and he impressed upon me the seriousness of really doing the due diligence on these. He encouraged me to go and actually visit the sites, which I tried to do. But from a practical standpoint, we're getting this published typically on a Thursday or a Friday, and we meet the following Thursday. So all of us want to be responsive, but we also have busy calendars. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if it's possible to wall that out and get that sooner, or if it's just something we just have to live with.
No, and we can definitely get it to you. So I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with this, but this is how we've been operating and so we have the first Monday of the month as our submittal day, okay? And if you submitted let's say the first Monday of October here, that would mean that you would either be on the Community Development Committee agenda in November or the Board of Adjustment Committee meeting in November. And so can be a fairly significant delay considering that our construction season, is 3 to 5 months. You're talking 2 months of your building season that you need to plan ahead and you could be delayed. Whereas reality in that we only need about 3 weeks for a hearing notice so we got to get it to the paper on a Friday. They publish it the following Thursday, and then we got 2 weeks from there. So, and basically during that time is when our staff is putting the packet together and then we got 1 week before the meeting. So that's the super tight time frame. But again, you're down to less than a month, So, but with the towns and in our effort to try to get town input, and that's why it's at the current 2 months, and that's so that it gives them a chance to have a planning commission and a board meeting a lot of the times.
So,
there's-
just my follow-up is, if there's any way for us to be in the loop just on the CUP part, and I did like at the last meeting where we had those applicants have the ability to speak first, since they're paying for this. I thought that was a good process at the last committee meeting, so. But it's a request, not a must-have.
I guess, yeah, I suppose, is there any reason you couldn't send those out when you send out the request for it to be published in the newspaper?
Correct.
Yeah.
Jason's staff could probably send out the application packet that the applicant submitted anytime before the agenda, and the agenda packet is published in Civic Clerk. It's just timing wise with his staff.
Yeah, so in other words, I mean, I could get you the application materials, but you wouldn't have the staff report and that, but I mean, the application materials could be almost 2 months in advance of the meeting. So, yep. A lot of times our staff reports are not getting done until like the day of that I gotta publish the packet. So that's usually what's holding me up on getting the packet done, so anyway.
And I'll send an email to the supervisors, just, the statute that governs conditional use permits is 5969(5)(e), and there's the definition of substantial evidence that Jason went through is probably the most important thing to focus on, that you need to do facts and information, and that's what you take into consideration, not merely personal preferences or speculation. So I think that's important, especially if you have a lot of objections to something, it needs to be based on facts and information and data, not just because I don't like it or this might happen. It has to be something that's factual. And I think if you can make those factual findings, which obviously Jason and his staff are good about putting into the staff report, like what are the facts of this application, that is what will be upheld if it gets appealed.
Jason, if you could do that, I think that would be, when you get the packets in, just to forward them, but what it would help us with anyway would be to kind of do a pre-review. I know it's before your guys have had an opportunity to do it, but it would also give us the opportunity then to have enough notice that this is where these property locations are, and you can go out and get a chance to drive it, and so that we're better prepared for the meeting, I think would be a benefit.
Yep, not a problem.
Thank you.
That's no problem at all.
If I could, Jason, add, make sure the address is on there, because the northwest quarter of the southeast doesn't always put it where it should be. I should know that, I did it one time, but yeah, just put, 1030 Maple Street or whatever.
Yep. All right. Are we ready to jump into our next agenda item?
Yes.
Okay. And so, in the memo here, basically, the difference with a renewable energy system ordinance as in compared to just putting provisions in our chapter 15 general zoning ordinance is that this renewable energy systems ordinance would apply countywide. And that because it doesn't, or it's not tied to the zoning maps and the general zoning districts, and that chapter 15 is. So good or bad, and that it's the way that it would be applied, very similar to like our land division ordinance, that applies countywide. It would not apply within the incorporated areas though, because the cities and the villages have their own home rule authority there. So I'm gonna jump into the document. So this, the way it's currently worded, and I apologize, but I have not had a chance to review Celeste's comments from today, but I think she maybe got some tweaks to this one. But it will not apply to any household energy systems mounted on top of the roof. And so that's kind of a big thing that we talked about before. We've talked about battery storage system, so we've got that defined here. I will say that you'll see a lot of definitions or terms here, and you're like, what is that? Do we really need that in here? And those are coming out of the administrative code and the statute. So that they're exactly, so like this 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., that's statute. That's not just arbitrary numbers. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights going through decommissioning then. One thing that this specifies is it talks about the above ground portions of them and also the below ground portions. And so if they are putting in footings and that they would have to remove the concrete structures for 4 feet or more below the grade. So that's kind of a big thing. That's similar to what we see with our cell phone towers and that's generally 8 feet below grade that they have to take them down to. So impermissible interference. We had some conversation about this at one of the
Excuse me, Jason, can
committee
you roll
meetings.
back 4 feet or more below the grade?
Yep.
Why 4 feet? Is that typically the depth?
And that I think the piers are actually in deeper than that normally. And so I don't know if it's because they're normally in ag fields and they're not tilling that deep, you know. I don't know.
So if the installation is, let's say, a shorter one, and they're not, now they'd probably all be at least 4 feet.
So if it was shorter, then they would be removing the whole thing.
Okay,
So in
all
other
right.
words, the top 4 feet has to be clean.
My head was getting stuck there.
Okay.
I think part of that is, I think that applies to wind generators more so because they're 28 feet down.
Yep.
And to make someone take 28 feet of concrete is a lot, yeah. Whereas most of these solar things, well, it appears now they just drive them in. I know the ones that we did at St. Croix Electric, there's no concrete involved at all. They're screwed in the ground,
Okay.
screwed out.
Yep. At one of our last committee meetings and that we talked a lot about impermissible interference. And basically that's where you got a proposed solar site and then you got property and that adjoining it. And let's say that this property owner doesn't like that this proposed solar site is there. They can't go and they can't plant a whole bunch of trees to try to take and limit the effectiveness of that solar panels because of those trees. That would be what they would call impermissible interference. This whole language here is from statute, and we've got another chunk in the ordinance that talks about the remedy process if you are involved in impermissible interference. However, if you've got a nice, woods and there's a proposed solar project that comes on the property adjoining you, and that you were there first, and that is not impermissible interference. So. One thing about this ordinance is it really breaks down the size of the systems into a few different categories and how we classify them. So we got large scale is 100 megawatts or more. Those are going to be to the PSC permitting process. This still doesn't give us authority over the PSC. Then we've got mid-scale energy, 30 to 100 megawatts. These are the ones that we probably want to take and be administering or enforcing and that the most. And then also down below, there's small scale, which is 0 to 30 currently. We got it defined here, a non-participating property means real property that is not a participating property in the project. Non-participating residence is a household or whatever that's not located on the property that is being done. So it would be on a non-participating property. And then we've got participating property is the property that is subject to the agreement, is underneath a waiver of a requirement. So if the adjoining landowner gave up their rights and that for whatever reason for a setback, that would be a participating property because they have given consent. And then participating residence or household obviously is a residence that's on the participating property. Private use, and that means that it's an accessory use to the existing parcels, structures or buildings and that on that property. And it's only providing power for structures on that property. So it's not intended to provide power to serve multiple homes that are not located on that site. And again, the key words there are that it's only for that same parcel and that it's an accessory use to the property. For example, the Excel stuff that we're seeing in that they're taking whole parcels and it's the primary use of that whole parcel. There's not a dwelling on a lot of those pieces of land. Roof mounted, what do we consider that? It'd be 20 feet above the highest point of the structure. So in other words, that would allow for a full panel and that to be on the roof. And then we got small scale energy system here. Supervisor Shirley, and that had brought up a couple meetings ago, I think it was, about a solar facility being defined. And so we put in the definitions here, means an integrated installation designed for large-scale solar generation where all the land parcels comprising of the facility are physically adjacent and form an uninterrupted area. So that was one change that we had from one of our meetings. So again, a lot of these definitions are right from administrative code, but do you see anything that stands out? Okay, if not, we'll jump into the general provisions. So provision A here has to deal with the change of ownership of the facility. And then sub 1 here allows us to make sure that they have the financial assurance requirements needed because of the ownership change. So, oh yeah, Supervisor Counter.
Sorry, I just had one thing on, when you're calculating setbacks on these, what, did we just go through the setback or is that coming up yet?
And that's coming up yet.
Okay, I'll wait till you do the setback.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. I
Yep,
won't
no
jump.
problem.
Thank you.
Yep. Sub B here, and that has to deal with annual training for our emergency management department, sheriff's department, or any other, volunteer, police, fire. And it's up to 8 hours of training per year. And a lot of that is because of new staff, maybe new equipment, maybe there's new people and that in charge of these facilities. And that's so that everybody has a face to the name. The emergency plans that are required to be submitted to the county. And so that would be submitted to these 5 people or organizations. So it's the county, and then it's the town clerks. Also, the city or village clerks within the extraterritorial zoning area of 1.5 miles. And then any other local police, first responders, and that may need those emergency plans. Okay. One of the things is that they would provide a 24-hour emergency contact telephone number, and that would be at every intersection of the energy system access roads with a public road. So in other words, wherever an emergency responder or the member of the public is traveling on a public road and they were going to go into the facility, of course, I'm sure it'd be gated and that, but there would be a contact number at those spots. Supervisor Van Summeren.
Jason, so how is that policed? And here's why I asked that, because we have radio towers, some tall towers in St. Croix County that have no emergency contact number anyplace. They're in the middle of the section, so they're just about a half mile off of any road, and perhaps there is one way back in there, but we can't drive in that. No one can drive in that property because it's private property. So there also should be something in here that says that 24-hour emergency contact telephone number is at the road.
Okay.
Because I've had actually a couple of calls since I've been on the county board about lights that were not flashing on towers, radio towers.
Okay.
And no one knows how to contact the people. And so they called, well, I know in one case they called St. Croix Electric because they provide electricity there, but they can't give out a phone number, privacy thing.
Okay.
So I think we have to put on that has to be at the road.
At the road. Okay,
Right,
I can
so-
add that
Right, so that people can
somehow
find
in
that
here.
number. Thank you.
Okay.
I actually, in that case, had to call one of my friends who's a airplane pilot, and he gave us the number of the FAA, and that happened
so-
real quick after that.
Just,
Yeah, I think that'll be fine. I'll have to retweak that wording a little bit.
just as part of point D though, right? I mean,
Yep, it'll be
just
in D.
expand letter
Yep.
D.
I think the last sentence is trying to get it, or get to that same point. An owner shall post these signs at every intersection of an energy system access road with a public road and at each wind turbine location in a wind energy system. And so I think it's trying to get there in that, but I'll make sure that it's, at the right of way or something like that. So, yep. Yep. E kind of goes back and that to the emergency side of things as well, but also that they would notify the administrator, which would be our department, our land use administrator, if there is an emergency on that energy system within 24 hours. And so that just makes the county aware of what's going on too. Okay, the next one, and that also has to deal with training, but it's more on the applicant or the owner of the system side to make sure that their operators and supervisors are adequately trained to ensure compliance with the procedures in the emergency management plan. Okay. So then the next one, and that is that the owner shall provide the administrator and emergency management director with a copy of its review of the emergency management plan and procedures after the event, if they were effectively followed. So it's just kind of, again, revisiting that plan, seeing if it was okay, and if not, revising the plan to do so. The provision H or sub H here talks about an annual report with the department documenting the operation and maintenance of the renewable energy system during the previous calendar year. That's important in that because decommissioning kicks in after the facility is no longer under production and that or producing power. And so that is our tool to really keep track of when it's no longer in production. Sub I here is just talking about all necessary state and federal permits and approvals to the county shall be submitted to us within 30 days of the receipt of their their permit. Sub J here is probably one that is very important, and the reason why the county would consider an ordinance like this, because an owner shall utilize all applicable best management practices in the placement, construction, operation, and maintenance of a renewable energy facility to preserve agricultural areas by minimizing soil compaction, topsoil loss, mixing, and to avoid and repair any damage to any drainage systems on agricultural land. The applicant shall describe the best management practices they intend to use in the placement, construction, operation, and maintenance of its energy facilities in its application. And so I think that kind of addresses a lot of the long-term impacts that these facilities might have. Any comments on that? Yeah, Supervisor Rice.
What does the application look like? Is it the same application that's used for the PSC?
No, currently it's just our normal conditional use permit application. That's what it's currently.
It strikes me that these are such unique systems that we might want to have a special application.
Good.
I mean, I'm hearing that, these applications for the large scales are 2,000 plus pages. So maybe I don't want to delay this and keep us any longer, but we probably should look at what the application
Yeah,
looks
no,
like.
that's more, management or administrative and that as far as getting that application put together. But right now, under Chapter 15, there's a lot on wind, but we don't have that much on solar to really justify a bunch of extra submittals. So that's why there's currently not one, so.
I'm wondering, as we're going through this, earlier we were talking about in the definitions, the different sizes with the small, mid, and large. With the large referring to the PSC. I wonder if, because of current legislation, depending on what happens, do we want to define those as going to the PSC, or do we want to define them as per state statute in case they change, and then we have to go back in here and change this again?
I think we've got it in there someplace.
I think it says in the large scale. I think in the definition it says
Okay,
with over 100, it is referred to the PSC, but I don't know how Corp Council thinks about that.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that further. I mean, that's why Jason put all the relevant statutes in the beginning section in the purpose and authority. So that's what governs this. And then towards the last part of the document, we always put in language regarding amendments to the chapter that if state law changes, it's also applicable to our ordinance. So that might cover what you're talking about, but I'll look at this a little bit further to see if there needs to be additional language.
okay, so,
One more to add too on it. As you're talking about all these different items here in this particular section in J, you're talking about soil compaction, topsoil loss mix, preserving ag land. One of the other things that we've kind of learned from all of the people that are coming in with our current situation is, do we want to also address subsoil, dealing with potential geological issues? Or do we want to leave that alone?
it's up to you.
We're dealing with the karst issue that we talked about with all the other, that has been pretty prevalent in this particular one, and we do know that those conditions are very prevalent in St. Croix County. Is that something, because of potential water contamination and that we at least address that's been reviewed?
I was going to bring that up later, but I was going to suggest that maybe we cut that off at the mid-size and above that will require a geotechnical engineering report. So I don't know if we necessarily need them for the small. I mean, you're talking 0 to 30. I don't know that we need to, those people putting up those small systems, we need them to go through the expense of the geotechnical engineer, but.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they would have to go to that extent, but if there was evidence of, say, a sinkhole or something that would lead you to believe, hey, maybe you should look into this before you do it, because of the potential issue that could come about, just, it saves everybody. So,
Can definitely add both of those, so. Sub K here, and that except for the physically occupied area by the renewable energy system, an owner shall restore the topography, soils, vegetation of the project area to the original condition after construction is complete. So that's kind of in that with our ground cover and stuff, making sure that it's just not left bare. L is a very simple one. It's basically just making sure that access easements and any kind of other agreements are recorded in the ROD office. Now, sub M, and that since we've been working on that other joint development agreement, this here has hold harmless and indemnify the actual property owner, and I think I would like to take and work with Heather on seeing if we need to have another provision about the county in there. So I'm not sure it'll be exactly M, maybe we'll just have a separate provision for that.
I would echo that.
Okay. It's one of the things I caught when I was reading through it today, so.